announce to you they're going to announce to you that anybody that's interested in obtaining a certificate of attendance can obtain this from DBHDS. So they'll give you a prompt at that point. This is a 5-part training series. One does not have to attend a particular training to be able to sign up for the next one. You can attend all of them, or you could do it piecemeal if you'd like to. Several of them later in this month are eligible for continuing education units through the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. But we can provide a certificate of attendance to anybody that's interested in obtaining one. So to obtain that certificate of attendance, you need to be in the training from start to finish, and you'll also need to provide your name and email address when you're prompted to do so by the trainers and the relevant ASR. So I just want to be clear, we're not going to be able to provide certificates of attendance to people that don't attend the entirety of the training, or folks that do not provide their name and email during the training. So if you want to get that certificate of attendance, please make sure that you provide your name and email when prompted to do so, and that you stay in the training until it concludes. All right, I'm going to go ahead and shift gears at this point. I'm very excited to announce our trainers. Catherine Williams and Stephanie Jones are here from West Virginia University for the entirety of this training series. And for those that aren't aware, West Virginia University is continuously recognized as having one of the premier behavior analysis doctoral programs in the world, not just in the country, but in the world. And both of our presenters have worked in Dr. Claire St. Peter's Severe Behavior Lab at WVU, and I'm just over the moon thrilled to have them here joining in today to provide this training, as well as the 4 other training topics that they're going to deliver later this month. 2 of them actually will be later this week. So a little bit more detail about each of our presenters. Catherine Williams is a board certified behavior analyst who's going to earn her PhD in psychology with an emphasis in behavior analysis from WVU in August 2021. She has primarily provided behavior analytics services for students and teachers in public schools to support the development of efficacious treatment plans for students who engage in disruptive behavior in special education or general education classrooms. In addition to her clinical work, she also conducts research to identify effective instructional practices across a wide range of laboratory and classroom settings, and has served as a guest reviewer and guest associate editor for several peer-reviewed journals. In July 2021, she will begin a postdoctoral fellowship in clinical / translational research at the Marcus Autism Center at Emory University. Stephanie Jones is also a BCBA with a PhD in psychology with an emphasis in behavior analysis from WVU. She's worked with individuals with severe and disruptive behavior in residential, recreational, clinical, and educational settings. Her research focuses on identifying efficient and effective interventions for problematic behavior that are realistic for caregivers to implement. And she does this by focusing on researching effects of incorrect implementation on common reinforcement-based procedures, ways to improve the quality of staff training, and the extent to which behavior support plans are likely to facilitate successful behavior change. She has served as a guest reviewer and guest associate editor for several peer-reviewed journals, and she's going to begin service as an assistant professor in the Applied Behavioral Analysis graduate program at Salve Regina University in September 2021. So, without further ado, Introduction to Functional Behavior Assessment with Stephanie Jones and Catherine Williams.
Hello. So great to see you all here today, or some of you. See many of your names. Throughout the day, we are going to be using a pair deck in order to provide some opportunities to respond. So you see information on your screen right now about how to join that. You can go to joinpd.com and enter in this 6-letter code JKJNOY, no space in the middle. And that will allow you to then answer questions. And that will also be how we collect your information, as like your name and your email address, if you would like the certificates mentioned there. So go ahead and take a quick minute to join. You can join on your computer or on your mobile device, your iPad. It works on basically anything with a browser. And then feel free to put any questions you have in the chat and we'll be happy to help you. But I'll give you just a minute to go ahead and join on there. The link is just joinpd.com. So you can't click on it, you'll have to type it in. Thanks for putting that in the chat there. All right, I'll give you all just another minute and then we'll get going. The code is JKJNOY. You can also see it on this screen on the Zoom. Thanks for putting that information in the chat. Okay, it looks like the majority have joined. Continue to join in. And actually, as I remove this screen, you'll still be able to see the code in the top right corner. So you can join in whenever you're able. And feel free to keep putting questions in the chat at any point. Whichever one of us is not talking, we'll be there to answer those for you. So Stephanie would be happy to help you connect to Pear Deck if you are having any issues connecting. All right. So today we're going to be focusing on the functional behavior assessment and how we can decide how to conduct those, what should be involved in conducting these assessments, and then also how we can interpret the information that we connect from this assessment. And you will hear us mention several times that we are going to use this information to develop some kind of behavior plan. And we really encourage you guys to come on Wednesday at 9, same time, same link. And we're going to be talking more about how you take the information that you get from these kinds of assessments to then develop a successful behavior plan. But first of all, just a couple of Zoom, what to do, what not to do is here. We really want to interact with you. And I know that that's really hard when there's 83 of us and counting, and we're on Zoom and I can't see many of your faces. And really you just see my face. So please, I encourage you to put questions in the chat as we go through. We'll hopefully have some time at the end to have some questions at that point. And if you want to turn your video on, we'd love to see your face. And then continue to just respond in Pear Deck. We really want to cater this training to something that is going to be meaningful to you. And so the more that you tell us how you want to use it, how you, what you hope to learn from this, the more we're going to be able to do that. So continue to just be active, and we appreciate that. So this is just a quick survey using Pear Deck. So if you pull up Pear Deck, you'll be able to now just enter your name. And we'll also use this as information to send those certificates. And I'm going to do this periodically. So at the beginning, middle, and end of today's training. So if you miss it today, or you notice your friend shows up late or anything, we'll grab your information at a later time. Great. I see lots of people are entering. Awesome. All right. And then your email address. And this is again, just so that we can make sure you get that certificate for being here. Thank you all. This is great. All right, looks like almost everybody's done typing. I'll give you another couple minutes. All right, great. And again, if you did miss this or you see somebody come in late, we will be collecting this information a couple times throughout today just to make sure we get it from everybody. So now we'd like to learn just a little bit about who you are and how we can best fit this training to the way you're going to use it. So please just enter in a couple words what population or populations you tend to provide services for. See lots of IDD or IDDD. Yeah, adults with developmental delays. Exactly. Great. A wide range. This is really exciting. I can't wait to hear all of you guys' thoughts and insight as we go through some of this material, because I think it's something everybody can use, but it's gonna differ a little bit from person to person. And I'm sorry, I just got an alert that my internet's unstable. Hopefully it will stabilize, but let me know if you can't hear me. All right. And then where do you provide these services? So are you in a clinical setting, a school-based setting, in-home treatment? In-home, higher ed? That's great. Residential, community. Excellent. So again, a really diverse group, which is awesome. That means you are going to each kind of come from a different perspective and have a lot to contribute to the different ways that we can provide these assessments and ultimately develop these plans. Thank you all. So you came here today and I appreciate that. What are you most excited about learning during this training? Like if you only get one thing out of it, what would you want to learn? Yeah, increase your knowledge on SBA and expanding your knowledge to new assessment tools. Great. I love that. Practical and effective assessments. Yes, Stephanie.
I'm just going to hop in real quick. I am so happy that everyone is interacting in the chat. Just so you all know, when we do ask these kind of questions, you should have something pop up that will prompt you on Pear Deck to communicate with us. And that just lets us have all the answers in one place. The chat will be really great if you have any specific questions that you want one of us to answer immediately, as one of us will always be monitoring it. But otherwise, please try to use Pear Deck. And if you do have any Pear Deck specific questions, feel free to put those in the chat as well.
Thanks, Stephanie. All right. Well, I appreciate you guys all sharing with that, and we will do our best to talk about how to apply these, particularly in those settings. But if you do have any questions as we go through, or you're like, yeah, I don't see how I would use this, please put that in the chat and we will address it either now or at the end. A couple of just Zoom expectations. We would appreciate if you continue to respond to the interactive activities. So that is through Pear Deck again, not so much through the chat, but through entering these cues on your phone or whatever internet source you have. Also continue to ask questions as we go through, and Stephanie, when I'm speaking, and when Stephanie will speaking, we'll kind of interrupt each other to ask those questions and make sure that they get addressed. And then also share your expectations and your experiences and examples. Again, this is a really diverse group, and I think that will make this training even more impactful as you guys bring up ways that you plan on using this or have used things like this, what's been successful, what barriers you've hit, and we can talk about those as we go. And that can just be put in the chat at any time. Okay, so starting with a little bit of the content today. What is an FBA? Well, we conduct FBAs in order to figure out why a behavior is occurring. And then once we identify why a behavior is occurring, we can start to use that information to find an effective treatment. But it's like a way of jump-starting a plan. It's similar to going to your doctor and telling them your symptoms, except this time we're getting the symptoms from our observations. And it's based on what happens in the environment before and after a behavior. So we're not super focused on talking about what the behavior is. We're talking about under what circumstances it is likely to occur and how we might be able to then change those circumstances to make the behavior less likely. This is used to create function-based plans. And function-based plans, meaning that it's based on the results of a functional behavior assessment, have been shown to be more effective than plans that have been created not based on a particular function. And it allows for the development of an individualized, least restrictive plan for individuals. So if you know that a particular response has a particular function, then you provide support for that function in the plan, but you don't need to provide added support for other functions that might actually result in more restrictive services. So it allows you to really create that individualized experience for all of your the individuals that you work with. An FBA is appropriate when undesirable behavior is already occurring. So you don't need to conduct an FBA if there's not already problem behavior that is going on in the environment. And it's also important that an FBA only be conducted when a doctor has verified that there's no medical causes, because when we're feeling ill, we may act out, we may not feel well, we may not know how to communicate that, and that may result in problem behavior. But that's not something that a functional behavior assessment is going to be able to address. And in fact, a functional behavior assessment could make that situation worse. So it's really important that when deciding whether or not to do an FBA, that you involve a medical professional also to confirm that there's no medical reason that these behaviors may be occurring. There's also important that the current situation already has appropriate social and health supports. So if you put it, like if I'm in an environment where I'm not already receiving sufficient food or receiving sufficient attention from individuals or receiving sufficient supports in that way, then that could be a reason that I engage in problem behavior that may be beyond what can be addressed with a functional behavior assessment. So it's very important that you ensure that these services are already in place prior to conducting a functional behavior assessment to add additional supports. And then finally, used to inform a treatment. So functional behavior assessments should not be done in isolation. They should be done in order to be used to develop something more substantial to then address the problem you're finding. So plan on, whenever conducting an FBA, then following that up pretty quickly with a behavior plan to address these results. All right, so that was just a quick introduction to FBA and what we're going to be talking about today. And we're going to kind of take it across 4 different general topics. First, we're going to talk about what is behavior. Then how does the environment affect behavior? And then go more into the assessment portion, where we talk about how we identify behavior, why behavior is happening, and then how do I interpret the results from the analyses from this identification. So starting off today with just what is behavior? What behaviors can we define, and what do we define, or how do we define a behavior? So why is it important to be on the same page about what a behavior is? Well, if you're not on the same page about what behavior you're targeting or what a behavior is, then it's going to be really hard to communicate with your team about what's going on. And in addition, knowing what a behavior is allows you then to collect data, to conduct these assessments, and then take action based on what you are seeing. But if you're not on the same page about what behavior is being targeted or what behavior is being discussed, then this is going to be very difficult to do. So I'm just going to start out with a quick and simple definition of behavior. Behavior is anything an organism does. Anything. So there's a quick test that's been thrown around in the literature about determining whether something is or isn't a behavior, and it's called the dead man's test. So the general idea here is if a dead man can do it, it isn't a behavior. So for example, can a dead man lie on the floor? And I know you can't really respond to this, but think, yeah, a dead man can lie on the floor. Okay. Can a dead man write their name on a sheet of paper? No, that is a behavior. That is something that a dead man cannot do. So that's just a quick and easy test of what is a behavior. So here comes your first opportunity to respond here. The situation is ask for help. Based on the dead man test, would you consider this a behavior? I see the results coming in. All right. So here we have the responses. The large majority of you all that answered said that this is a behavior. And I agree, this is a behavior because this is not something a dead man can do. I don't know of any dead man that can ask me for help. So in this case, I would consider this a behavior. All right. What about stay in their seat? Would you consider this a behavior? All right, responses are slowing down. I'm gonna go ahead and lock it. We're a little bit more up in the air about this one. So the majority said no. So let's take a look at this though. Stay in their seat. If I put a dead man in a seat, are they gonna stay there? Depending on the movie you're watching, but hopefully, right? They're probably gonna stay there. So in this case, I think this is a failure of the dead man's test, right? A dead man can do it, so that's not a behavior. So you might be thinking to yourself a little bit, okay, so if I want somebody to stay in their seat then, like I think like I'm talking about behavior, right? Well, you might want them to stay in your seat, but what you really want them to do is to go to their seat, sit there for a certain period of time and leave their seat. There's action involved and there's duration involved in that behavior, but the behavior itself is not staying in their seat. It's how long between getting in the seat and leaving the seat. So it gets complicated as you start to talk about some of these behaviors, but I like it because it also means you have to start thinking about what do you want the individual you're working with to do instead, because we don't want to get rid of behavior. We want to find an appropriate replacement behavior when there's undesirable behavior. So if you want somebody to stay in your seat, well, maybe it's that you want them to stay in their seat while they eat their food. And so then you start to say, okay, well, really the behavior I care about here is that they're eating their food. And now you're focusing on increasing that desirable behavior rather than getting caught up in something that would be harder to measure. And we'll talk a little bit more about this today. It gets complicated for sure. Okay. What about this one? Be non-compliant. Would you guys consider this a behavior based on the dead man's test? And think about it. How would you measure it? How would you want to set it up if you want? Responses are rolling in. It's so exciting. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and lock it. The majority says that this is not a behavior, but we still have a couple people who are saying that this is a behavior. So let's talk about this one a little bit more too. I will admit that early in my years of training too, I thought this was a behavior. I was like, of course, somebody's being non-compliant. They're not doing their work. Like that's a problem behavior. I'm going to address it. But much like staying in your seat, being non-compliant isn't doing something. I can tell a ghost to do their work as many times as I want, and they're going to continue to be non-compliant, right? So again, I want to focus on that alternative behavior. How often are they doing their work? And that's the behavior that I might target. Or how often do they follow instructions? And so just continuing along this path, being non-compliant would not be a behavior, but you could use something like doing their work that would be a behavior to get at that same response.
And we just had a wonderful point put in the chat that I'd love to highlight for a second. And that the term be non-compliant, and this is a bit of a spoiler for what's coming in a moment, may contribute to some of the confusion with the dead man's test, because what does be non-compliant mean? If it means putting your head down on the desk, dead men are great at putting their head down on the desk. But if it means, you know, saying some cuss words or anything like that when asked to do an activity, that probably wouldn't pass the dead man's test. So thank you for the folk who put that in the chat, and I'm appreciating interacting with you all.
Yes, that's awesome. That's a great point. And thank you, Stephanie, for bringing that up. Yeah, and that's actually directly related to what I was wanting to talk about next, which is that behavior needs to be observable and measurable in order for us to be able to use it in treatment. So behavioral is observable if we can measure it directly and we agree on when it happens. And so that's really thinking about how are we going to measure this behavior? What responses are included in being non-compliant that are going to be the ones that we measure? Is it that they don't put their head down, or that they put their head down on the table? That could be a response that we measure. So thinking about this, I gave you this definition of a behavior, hitting an adult. Is this an observable behavior? Wow, I love the decisiveness of this group. I don't think I have ever seen a chat where everybody agrees on the same response. That's amazing. Yes, this is absolutely an observable behavior. We're talking about hitting an adult. Okay, what about being upset? Is this an observable behavior? Do you think you'd be able to collect information on this as well as hitting an adult? All right. Little less decisive, but I agree with the majority, no. And I think one of the comments in the chat says this really well, not unless it is defined. So like this is potentially something that you could then define and measure. But if I just give you this and I say, yeah, let me know how often they're upset, that's not going to result in a definable, measurable, observable data collection. Because being upset looks like a lot of things depending on the individual, and we can talk about those instead. So that leads to the next slide here. What behaviors could be observed if someone is upset? How might you define that? Yeah, we've got lots of great responses here. I'm going to show you a couple. So for example, here's a couple you see, and it collects a couple of behaviors here, right? Crying, yelling, stomping feet, verbal expressions. And this are each things that you can measure that are specific. And that is getting upset for that individual. But for another individual that you work with, it might look different. Like for me, when I get upset, I'm probably just going to get really quiet and maybe put my head down. And so that's still getting upset, but that looks very different. And so again, we're looking at the different responses for that individual and what that looks like so that we can then collect data on it accurately across individuals.
I'm just going to hop in again real quick. I just got a message that some folks are responding in the chat for stream text. And unfortunately, neither Catherine nor I are able to access that chat. So if you'd like to communicate with Catherine and I or provide information on Pear Deck, please use joinpd.com or the Zoom chat. If those are not accessible to you, please let us know.
Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate that. All right. So talking a little bit more about how we're actually going to define a behavior and why we're going to do that. Defining the behavior, as I mentioned, allows you to collect data on a specific behavior, and it ensures that you're going to get consistent measurement across people and across observations. So one thing you want to make sure is that one day, if you're collecting data on inappropriate responses, the next day you're collecting data on that the same way. So writing a good definition of behavior is going to allow you to do that. And then finally, it allows you to make informed decisions. Again, over and over again, we're going to be talking about data-based decision-making. And today is focusing on how you get those data. And Wednesday will be focusing on how you make those decisions based on it. And so really just getting good data allows you to make better decisions. So now I've talked about how to define behavior in general. What isn't a behavior. But I'm going to talk more specifically about how we can define a particular behavior. So how to write an operational definition of a response. And what's important about these definitions is that they need to be observable, or they need to be objective, and they need to be measurable. So an objective response means that if two individuals score the same behavior at the same time, then it's going to be objective. And it's going to be agreed on that when it happens and when it doesn't happen. And it also means that it avoids words that also then themselves need to be defined. Or if you include other words that need to be defined, that those words are defined themselves. So here are two definitions, and I want you to pick the one that you believe is most objective. And this is a definition for aggression. Great, I won't close it, but I'm going to close it because people always change their answers if I don't. Here are the responses so far. The large majority says that they like definition B better. And I agree. Definition B here says contact between a hand or foot and one individual that leaves a visible mark on another individual. That's going to be something that is very objective. You don't have to determine the difference between what is a hit and versus what is a touch, or what is a kick versus what is a pinch, which would kind of be difficult in that first definition. And that first definition is an example of one where you really have a lot of words that you're going to have to define more. And so it's hard to determine what's a hit. For example, if I run up to Stephanie and I give her a high five, is that a hit? It might be. And so that gets a little bit difficult. But if you're saying, okay, hand or foot on another individual that leaves a visible mark, okay, high five is not going to leave a visible mark. So that wouldn't count as that definition. Hopefully, if you're high-fiving people and you're leaving a visible mark, it probably should be aggression. And then the other part of this, in addition to making sure it is clear and objective, is also making sure it is measurable. And part of making something measurable is specifying what counts as a single instance of that response and how will it be measured. And so there's a couple ways of measuring things. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Here are two definitions, and I want you to select the one that you think meets measurable better. Which of these is more measurable? All right. So the majority says that the first one is more measurable. And I would agree here. The first one makes it really clear when on task begins and when on task ends. And that's going to make it easy to know when it is occurring. Whereas the first one just says working on a task until the task is done and includes raising their hand, which is maybe useful, but it doesn't tell you, okay, so if I work on a task and then I stop working on it, and then I get back on it and I'm working on it, and then I get off it, and so on, is that going to be defined as being on task? How am I going to count that? Whereas the first one, it says, okay, well, if I get off for 3 seconds, then that counts as one instance of being on task. And then I need to move on to be on task again later. And so it's going to allow for different measurements of this. And so there's a lot of ways of measuring behavior. This is just one example. The important thing is that the way it is measured be specified in that definition so that it's clear when an instance of behavior has occurred.
And it's really wonderful
So
to
I
have
focus
these
a
really clear definitions of behavior, because I can give this to a staff member who's going to be, conducting my FBA or implementing my treatment. And I can say with confidence, this is something that I'm going to agree with you on when it happens or when it doesn't happen. And that's the power of these really clear definitions. There has been far too many times early in my career where I and one of my implementers weren't on the same page about whether behavior was or was not improving. And when I ended up problem solving through these, it always came down to a bad definition. So I remember earlier in my career, sometimes I would feel silly saying, okay, well, it has to leave a mark. You have to be able to hear a sound or anything like that specifically about the behavior. And then I realized how much that connects everybody who's involved in the plan to make sure that they're on the same page. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, Catherine, but I wanted to highlight some of the importance of these definitions.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Stephanie. And I agree completely. I've had those moments even after writing these definitions where you're in a room and you're collecting data together and you realize that even with the definition, you're not on the same page. So you need a better definition. And so it is really, really very important. Thank you. So we talked a lot about behavior so far, but most of today is going to be talking about things other than behavior. There's a bigger environmental picture of what's going on. And it reminds me, you'll see this picture of dominoes a couple times, because one behavior we look at might be that domino in the middle, but what goes on before and after it in the environment is what's causing that domino to fall over. And so by identifying what's going on before and after, we can stop the domino without having to worry about it. And so what I mean by that is identifying the antecedents and the consequence of a behavior, where the antecedent is what's going on right before the behavior and the consequence is what happened following that response. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these, how you identify antecedents, consequences, and motivating operations and what they are. And then Stephanie later is going to provide examples of how you can identify these by using different methods of data collection. So in your experience, what are some antecedents you've seen before when you see undesirable behavior? Give some examples.
One thing that's coming up in the Pear Deck, which is really interesting, is some of you are labeling what looks like behavior that the individual is engaging in before the more severe problematic behavior. And that makes a lot of sense when we talk about antecedents. But try to focus instead on not what the individual is doing, but what is happening around the individual. So are staff members interacting or not interacting with the individual? Did the individual just be asked to do something? I think it is really wonderful that you're noticing these smaller behaviors that lead up to the bigger behaviors, though. That can help you so much in your FBA and later development of your treatment plan. Some folks would call these precursor behaviors if they are reliable and happening each time before those larger behaviors. So just some clarification.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of them. There's a lot of great examples in here. Let me just show a couple of responses here. preferred item getting taken away, given a demand, an unexpected change in the environment, a change in routine. And those are definitely some common ones. And so I appreciate that. And there's a lot of them. And so antecedents are anything that happens before a behavior, and that kind of sets up that need for the behavior and might be the reason that the behavior is occurring. And so this is commonly talked about in terms of 3 antecedents that are fairly common. However, I want to emphasize that a lot of different things can be antecedents, and I really appreciate the variety of examples you guys provided. The 3 common ones are low attention, so meaning somebody's not attending to that individual, removing an item, which one of you guys mentioned in the peer deck I saw, and then placing a demand, which was also talked about in the peer deck. And those are 3 common categories, but again, there can be a lot more. And antecedents are different in every case. So it can be really easy to walk into an environment and be like, yeah, I'm pretty sure, like, I know this room and I know how it tends to happen in here, and it's probably going to be that they're not getting a lot of attention. But then you realize that actually the behavior doesn't tend to occur when there's not attention. It tends to occur every time the light switch gets turned off, or it tends to occur every time the bell rings outside or a car goes by. There can be a lot of different environmental antecedents, so it's really hard to identify these without getting direct observation and kind of maintaining an open mind. All right. So a couple things that I want to highlight that aren't antecedents, but can really commonly be misconceived as antecedents. Emotional states like frustrated. Those get really difficult, right? Because frustrated isn't the reason the behavior is occurring. There's something in the environment that has resulted in that frustration. And that frustration might be like those behaviors that Stephanie was talking about just a second ago, where it's kind of like a warning sign. You start to see pacing, you start to see putting head down on the table, and that's an indicative of frustration, but we can focus on those behaviors and when they're occurring. So is it when they're given a demand? What is it about the environment that's resulting in those behaviors that we're calling frustrated? Another non-example here is a diagnosis. So a diagnosis might tell us a little bit about what behaviors are common, but it's not going to tell us why they're happening. It's not a direct reason in the environment about what is causing this behavior to occur. And also, just from a practical point of view, if an individual has a diagnosis, we can't change that. We can't write that in their plan. An individual is diagnosed, so that's why they're going to do this, the end. No, we need something that we can change. And that's the power of finding these antecedents in the environment, is we have control over these. We can do something about them once we identify them to hopefully just stop this domino chain of events that results in problem behavior from occurring. So here's a quick opportunity for you guys to be involved. I'm going to try and show you a video. I'm hoping that this works. If it doesn't, I apologize. I'm about to show you a video. This was made in order to train individuals to collect data in a school setting. So this is, in this case, adults that I work with who are acting in the role of students engaging in problem behavior. So a little different than what many of you guys do. And I just want you to watch this video and then respond with what antecedents you see. Do you see the video? It's not playing. Stephanie, do you see the video?
It's loading.
Okay, great.
We can see but not hear it.
There's not much sound.
No! I don't want you to play with me.
Okay, so our target behavior here was hitting. I'm sorry, I didn't read that before I showed the video. But what did you guys notice happened in the environment before the individual hit the other adult? And I'm sorry, it sounds like some of you guys might not have been able to see it. There won't be many videos, but I think a couple of them it's more realistic to how you practice these in the real world. Yeah. So a lot of you guys said removing an item, touching an item. And I do think that removing an item is absolutely an antecedent that was involved here. A couple of you guys, though, also noticed that there wasn't much attention given before. And so that the adult was sitting next to her, but she wasn't talking to her. She wasn't interacting with her as her toy. So there was also a lack of attention. So keep in mind that oftentimes there's more than one antecedent going on. So be open to what the environment is kind of showing you and seeing everything that's going on. All right.
And that's also a really good point to kind of highlight that the antecedent of low attention is relative. And that might look different for everybody. So I've had plenty of clients where I could be having a conversation with the client, but I'm not giving them physical attention. And that ends up being an antecedent. So as Catherine mentioned earlier, these things are idiosyncratic per individual, and you might need to think a little bit outside of the box of these categories. So great point.
Perfect. And now I have another video. It's to show a similar situation, and I want to see what you guys say is the antecedent here.
No, Amanda, it's not nice to hit. We have to keep our hands to ourselves. No, I don't want to.
A little more going on, right? And this is, I think, a little bit more realistic of what you tend to see. There's a lot of interactions going on at the same time. And it's a matter of picking out all the little pieces that are going on in that environment. So one thing I want to highlight here, and I'll let you guys continue to enter response. Here's two responses. And what I appreciate about these responses is that they're looking at multiple things in the environment. So in this case, you saw the teacher touch the item again, but you also saw her not providing attention. And then you saw her reprimand, and then another hit happened. So there was a lot of different, almost conflicting things that were going on at the same time. And so Stephanie will talk more about how once you're collecting data like this, okay, first time she touched the item and there was no attention, second time she touched the item, but there also was a reprimand, how you then can sort out these data to try and find patterns that indicate which of these is causing the behavior and which of these might just kind of be coincidental.
I also love how some of these responses in Pear Deck, I can tell already some of you are starting to create a plan for this behavior. So someone has commented, removing an item without forewarning. Like, yes, it's a fantastic idea to write into someone's plan that you're going to warn them before you take an item. So I can tell we have a really strong group already looking to fix the problems, which I love.
Absolutely. So remember that an antecedent happens before response, and it starts to tell us more about why a behavior is happening. On the other hand, we've got consequences, and these are things that happen after the behavior, and they tell us what makes the behavior likely to occur again. And so in your experience, what kind of consequences happen after a response of undesirable behavior that might make it likely to happen again? And I don't see Pear Deck. Are you guys able to respond to this one? Okay, we'll let this one go. Sorry, I think there is a minor Pear Deck issue here. But we'll move forward. You'll have some chances to tell me some more about consequences. Okay, so consequences can be categorized by the effect that they have on the environment or the effect that they have on behavior. And when I talk about a reinforcing consequence or a reinforcer, what I'm meaning is that after this consequence happens, behavior is more likely to occur. And the only way that we know that something is a reinforcer is if we see it have that effect on behavior. So we might have a hypothesis that something is a reinforcer, but unless we deliver it after behavior and we see that behavior increase, then we don't know whether it's a reinforcer.
Catherine,
And
if
so
I
there
can
can be
interrupt you
several.
real quick, I'm sorry. Part of your screen is actually blacked out.
Oh,
It looks like you might have like a window hovering.
is that
Thank
one
you
more?
for the
Is
person
it
in the
better now?
chat who let me know. Yes, that's better. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate that. We had that problem as we were setting up earlier, but I just need to pay attention. Thank you. All right. So a couple of consequences can be socially mediated. And what this means is that another individual provides this consequence. And this is things like providing attention. So in that video we just watched, that reprimand, right? Amanda, don't do that. Or Amanda, I don't like when you hit me. That is a attention consequence provided by another individual. There might also be access to an item. So in the video we watched, we saw them remove the item, but it might also be like, I know when my cat starts to bother me a lot, I tend to throw a toy, right? And so I'm giving my cat a toy to play with. Or for example, if a student I'm working with is bothering me a lot, I might give them an iPad and then they go away and they're happy and they're working independently. And so that would be providing access to an item, or it might be escape from a demand. And so if I'm asking an individual to do a task like sit and eat, and then they start to throw a fit and they throw their food off the table, and then I don't replace that food in front of them, they have then escaped from that demand of eating the food. And so we really can only identify these reinforcers by looking at the effects that they have on the environment. So I might see a low attention situation and then hitting and then attention occur, just like we saw in that video. But unless I then start to see hitting increase over time, I don't know if the attention is actually what is resulting on it in that self-hitting. Similarly, I might have something like this. So there's low attention situation, and then they ask a question like, how are you today? As a way to appropriately request attention. And hopefully that results in attention, right? And then that response continues to occur. But what you can see sometimes is an individual might appropriately ask for attention and then not get it, in which case you have to figure out why is it that that appropriate response in the environment isn't resulting in attention, and therefore it isn't being reinforced, but that inappropriate environment that inappropriate behavior, like the one we just saw with self-hitting, results in attention that is then reinforced. So looking at the way that these things are interacting and the likelihood of appropriate and inappropriate behaviors getting attention.
The other piece of this is that it does not have to happen each time. So your data sheet doesn't have to say each time that they are not being provided attention, they are then engaging in the behavior. Because it can happen occasionally after the behavior, but be a really powerful reinforcer. And then individuals will continue to engage in that response, right? Kind of in the hopes of, one of these days, my implementer is gonna mess up and give me what I want. So just something to keep in the back of your mind.
Great point, yeah. All right, well, some of you guys already started sneaking on this one, but here is an example of a situation you might have. So in this situation, inappropriate language persists during work time. And this is sort of the cycle that's occurring. So what consequences might reinforce this response? And I just want you to base it on the information I'm giving here, not necessarily on the video we're watching. Okay, responses are stabilizing. The majority of you say escape from demand, and I agree with that as well. So in this case, it's indicating that they no longer have to do the task when they engage in inappropriate language. And so that probably indicates that this might be due to escape from that demand. That's assuming nothing else is happening. I'm giving you very little information here just to try and give you some simple examples, but in real life, there's of course a lot of things going on. What about in this situation? you see that they are given a task to do, they say, help please, and they're given a calculator, and then they don't ask for help anymore. Okay, so this is what we've got. The majority of you guys say that the potential reinforcer here is going to be access to an item. And I agree with you. If you have this situation where it's followed by this consequence of access to an item and the behavior persisted, then access to this item is likely a reinforcer for that response. But one tricky thing I did here is I didn't tell you whether the behavior persisted. I didn't tell you if they then continued to ask for help later on. In fact, I threw in there that they didn't necessarily continue to ask for help in the future. And so this is really easy to forget that there's a lot of things that happen in the environment, but we're only going to consider it a reinforcer if it results in an increase in that behavior, an increase in that response. So just make sure in your own practice to keep an eye out for that. Okay, I saw this happen, but did it increase the likelihood of a response?
Catherine,
All right.
the black box is periodically popping in and out of screen and covering some of the text. Just letting you know.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, it's when I move I have different windows open and one of them overlaps and it makes it black. So thank you for calling me out for it. One last thing that we haven't talked about in terms of consequences is when consequences aren't due to another individual. So I've talked about a person taking an item away, giving or removing a demand and giving attention. And that's all based on somebody else's behavior. But sometimes a consequence might have an effect that is not due to somebody else's behavior. In this case, it's due to the result of that exact behavior. And so one of the examples here might be self-stimulation, or it might be anything with tactile feeling or sensory items, stuff like that, where the effect of the behavior is in the behavior itself. And we call those automatically reinforced responses. And so an example of here might be if there's low attention, self-hitting, and then self-stimulation to then calm down or provide that sense of security while there's low attention. And you notice that it seems like it could be attention, right? It's an environment where there's not a lot of attention, but the behavior that the consequence that's actually maintaining this behavior is the sensation of that self-hitting. But much like antecedents, these are different for everybody. So what the reinforcer is for a particular behavior is widely various. I'll give you a quick example. This is my go-to. I had a client once and we could not figure out why he didn't want to get off the bus. And we worked so hard, like we made it so that if he got off the bus after he got to school, he had a party. I mean, there was bicycles, there was music, there was his favorite teachers. We rewarded that as much as we could. But the problem was, and we didn't realize this until much later on, the reinforcer for that response was access to the bus. He really liked being around buses and seeing buses move around. And so it's something that wasn't the first thing we thought of, but for him, that was the reason. So we had to figure out how to provide effective access to the bus that he could request appropriately. But that's just an example of many of how idiosyncratic these consequences can be. So I'm going to show you the same video I showed you earlier. And this time I want you to say what the consequence of that video might be. And it will take me just a second to get it loaded. And remember, the behavior here that we're targeting is hitting.
No.
Okay, so what might be that consequence that you're keeping an eye on after this? Yeah, so a lot of you guys are saying getting an item, or a couple of you all are also saying, let me pause the responses real quick. Oh, sorry, I lost this window. Stephanie, can you pause responses? Thank you. A lot of you guys are saying getting an item, but a couple of you guys are also saying no attention. And one thing I want to point out about consequences is that they're going to be changes in the environment. So in this case, this individual wasn't getting attention before, and that was something that we noted as an antecedent. But she also wasn't getting attention after, at least in this example. And so I wouldn't think that in this case, attention is what is maintaining the behavior based solely on the portion of that video we just watched, just because we didn't see attention increase following that behavior. And so that's where we got to be really careful with the difference between antecedents and consequences. Consequences is something that changes following the response. But I agree with the majority of you that this is maybe getting an item or getting that item back. Yes. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and skip the second one just for the sake of time today. So we talked a little bit about antecedent, behavior, consequence, and how those work together to kind of create this perfect storm of there is a need for a behavior, the behavior occurs, and it is reinforced by a consequence. However, the way these whole systems work can be affected by motivating operations and setting events. And so you might think about this as setting up the domino pieces. How are they aligned in a way that when you have that particular antecedent, then that behavior and consequence are likely to occur. And so I'm going to use the words motivating operation and setting events interchangeably. They're technically slightly different, but for the sake of how they inform practice today, we're going to use them as the same. So motivating operations and setting events make a consequence more or less reinforcing, and they change the types of behavior that are likely to occur in that situation. And so I'm going to give you my very real example, and hopefully it's early enough in the day that this isn't going to make you hungry. But think about hangry. So when you're hangry because you haven't eaten, different things are going to trigger you in the environment. And so it might be when I am hungry and you ask me to do my chores, I'm going to throw a fit so that I get out of my chores. But when I have just eaten and I'm feeling happy with the world and you ask me to do my chores, that's fine. And I will do my chores to then earn my break time or whatever contingency you might have set up. And so it shifts the way that behavior in the environment's reacting. It's sort of a larger change. And so these can be lots of big things in the environment. Like it might be that the individual's feeling ill. They have a cold or something. And so that might be a setting event for that particular situation. Or it might be that they just took their medication and the medication hasn't set in. So that could be a setting event. There are these larger environmental situations. So thinking about your own practice, what are some motivating operations or setting events that you have experienced? And I see a couple of you guys. Oh no, that's Stephanie in the room. Yeah. Oh, these are some good ones. Wow. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple, but you guys are really creative here. The lack of sleep, that's definitely a great setting event. I am a very different person when I have not gotten a good night's sleep. Hungry, tired, thirsty, bored. Nice weather when you love to be outside. Yeah, I love the weather example because you're right. The way the weather is can absolutely change how the day goes. These are really, really great. So, and there can be a lot of these, and they can look very different from environment to environment. And so if you start to do these assessments and you notice like, hey, one day this is clearly reinforced by attention, but the next day everything's fine, then you might start to look at what other setting events might be involved that motivate times when that behavior is or is not effective at getting that reinforcer. And so identifying, motivating, and setting up events can be very tricky because they occur on a larger scale and they're going to require a lot more data and a lot more information. Some common examples beyond the ones you guys said are illness, medical changes, lack of sleep, and many, many more. And so Stephanie is going to take over after a quick break and tell you a little bit more about how you might identify these different motivating operations and setting events. In the meantime, go ahead and take about 5 minutes. We'll see you at about 10:17. Use the restroom, get some water, get some coffee, and then we'll check in with you guys in 5 minutes.
Okay, everyone, we are a little bit past 10:17 now. And as you can tell, oh, this is Stephanie, I'm sorry for the closed captioning. As you can tell, Catherine and I are just going to switch hats a little bit, which means that Catherine will now be monitoring the chat and I will be presenting the remainder of the content. So if you do have any questions that you want a private message, please do so to Catherine Williams. Okay, as we get started, I'm going to go ahead and pop up the questions for check-in. So this is contributing to your certificate for completion. So please go ahead and enter your name into Pear Deck. If you missed the initial request for inputting your information into Pear Deck, please make sure that you do this one. And as a reminder, to get into Pear Deck, go to joinpd.com, and Catherine will put this in the chat. And then the code is JKJNOY. I'm going to give folks a few more minutes to get for a few more seconds probably to get their names in. I'm still waiting on about 30 of you. Okay, just a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. Now, please put in your email address. Great, just a few more seconds on this. And just for everyone else, we know that this is a pretty long training. We're trying to give as much information as we can in this window. We will provide you with another break in 40 minutes to an hour, depending on how timing goes. And we'll give you 10 minutes for that break. We know that you are probably need a drink of water and all that good stuff. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Great. So I'm really excited to chat with you about my portion today, because this is when we put on our detective hats and start to figure out why behavior is happening. And I think that this is one of the most empowering things in practice, that we can figure out the needs of an individual that are not being met in the environment by conducting a functional behavior assessment, and then create an individualized plan for that individual to serve their needs, to reduce that problematic behavior. And we know that when we reduce that problematic behavior, a million amazing things happen, right? They're able to reintegrate into their environment successfully, start to build relationships, and just generally relate better to, their peers and staff. So it's a very exciting when you are able to have a clean, conclusive functional behavior assessment. So I'm going to talk about how to know what to look for and how you can start investigating. So when you're presented with a case, you have a bunch of options for how you can start investigating. And I'm going to talk to you about this today in 4 different sections. The first is I'm going to talk to you a bit about what information you should gather during your FBA, what tools there are to help you complete your FBA, how you can select the tools for completing your FBA, and how to interpret the data from your FBA. And I kind of mix things up in a few different orders, but this is the general what I hope that you take away today. So first, there are 2 main ways to conduct a functional behavior assessment. And ideally, you combine bits and pieces of this. So the first is indirect. And basically what it means to do an indirect assessment is that you didn't directly observe the behavior. So examples of indirect assessments are often talking to stakeholders or caregivers about what the behavior looks like or what the environment looks like with that behavior. On the other hand, for direct observation, this involves directly observing the behavior. So this can be by just watching and observing, by interacting with the environment, conducting a functional analysis. All of those would go under the direct lump. But of course, when we're in these situations where individuals are engaging in problem behavior, we often know that they're very time sensitive, or that you may not have all the staff that you need. Now, if I had a quarter for every time I wish I had more time or more people to help me conduct a functional behavior assessment, I would have a lot of quarters, right? So it's important to put all of these in the thoughts of, okay, well, what do I actually have the resources to do and to do well? But ideally, and it's important that this is such, you do include some indirect and direct functional behavior assessment methods. So I'm going to now focus on indirect functional behavior assessment methods. And indirect functional behavior assessment methods are really beneficial for initial information collection. So for example, identifying times when the behavior is likely to occur is really going to help inform your direct observation. Direct observation, generally, depending on the type that you do, can take a long time. But doing some of this background indirect work can help you specifically target certain times when the behavior is likely to occur and save you time later down the road. Additionally, indirect assessments are really helpful for identifying possible setting events. And this is because setting events, like anger, not getting your medication, you might not be there to observe that setting event or motivating operation is in place. So this is really helpful for when you talk to caregivers and staff and say, okay, so what I'm seeing is that when they're not getting a lot of attention, they seem to engage in these behaviors, but it's on kind of random days to me. Is there any linkage that you know of that connects these days? And a lot of the times, and many of you put this in the pair deck, lack of sleep is a huge one. Not getting enough food in the morning is another big one. So I didn't cover everything. So I'd love for you guys to teach me a bit here. What information should you be gathering during an indirect assessment? And feel free to repeat some of the things that I said, but there's so many pieces of information that you can collect during an indirect assessment that will inform your subsequent direct observation, direct assessment, and development of a behavior plan. Wow, you guys are putting in some really great answers. And I just want to thank you all for your participation in Pear Deck. I'm sure many of us are getting a little sick of Zoom at this point, and it makes it so much more fun for Catherine and I to present these trainings, to be able to interact with you all, and Pear Deck is the best tool we figured out to do that. So a lot of gratitude on our end. Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and lock responses just to talk to you about some of the wonderful things that you put in. So there's some on here that I really love. So history, medical information, things that might not happen frequently, absolutely. So for example, there's a lot of cases that I've worked in with children that when they're in their dad's house, their behavior is one way. And when they're in their mom's house, their behavior is a different way. So those are some things that you can gather in this situation. Preliminary behavior definitions will hugely help you before you have to get to discussing what the behavior actually looks like with other staff members, as well as starting your observations. And I also love the comments on history. So just how often the behaviors are happening and how long they have been happening for in an individual's history is hugely helpful as you move forward with your process. So thank you all for providing these answers. I have some other ones that have just popped in. So possible reinforcers, because when you're conducting a functional behavior assessment, right, like your goal is on that behavior plan development. So when you're starting these indirect assessments, already thinking about that is totally wonderful. So figuring out some possible reinforcers for increasing appropriate behavior, as well as what's maintaining problematic behavior, will be helpful for you down in the long run. Possible antecedents and consequences are also really wonderful. But there's something to note here that's important, and that's generally our research suggests that caregivers are not incredibly accurate when labeling antecedents and consequences. They also generally provide vague antecedents and consequences or things that can't be observed in the environment. So Catherine gave some of those examples earlier, such as, well, before he engages in the behavior, he is upset. That makes sense, but that's not necessarily what we're looking for. We're looking for the environmental variables that increase the likelihood that the behavior occurs. So you do sometimes have to be careful and ask really specific questions from individuals to get better ideas of what the possible antecedents and consequences are. But ones that I always like to highlight are times of days, activities, and locations, because that helps you as you get to your direct observation to make sure that you are not wasting your time, right? So if they say, oh, he never engages in any problem behavior whatsoever at lunch, and you're consistently going to observe at lunch, that's going to drag out your functional behavior assessment for a while. And that's not to say that it's not beneficial to observe at least a few times in the environments when the behavior is unlikely to occur, because that might give you an idea of preventative things in that environment that are helping that behavior not happen. But you definitely want to be able to see the actual behavior that you're targeting. So there's a few different kinds of indirect assessment methods. The first are checklists. So this is something that already has pre-written questions that you could explain and then give to a caregiver to fill out privately. You could also walk a caregiver through it, but we'll talk about some of the benefits of checklists, and that's generally that you don't have to walk a caregiver through it all the time. And then the second kind are open-ended interviews. Excuse me. So exactly what they sound like, where you just ask them questions about things that happen in the environment. And what I love about open-ended interviews is that you can pivot as things become more clear to you. So for example, if all the questions are pointing toward when I place a demand on this individual, they are unhappy with me and they engage in problem behavior, then you can start to cater more specifically, okay, well, what is it about demands? And that might help you get to a function more quickly. But checklists are really good when there are multiple stakeholders. So for example, if you're working with an individual in a residential facility and staff work hourly, and there's day staff and night staff, and they work with about 4 staff during the day and about 4 staff at night. Conducting open-ended interviews with each of those staff members is going to take a lot of your life. So it might be easier and more efficient in this context to provide checklists to those staff members, explain them how to do it, and provide it to them, so that you could get an information of what is aligning across those different staff members. And then any patterns that might help make your open-ended interviews more efficient, or skip you straight to direct observation, depending on your time and resources. Checklists are also really good when there's a strong definition of the behavior. So someone in the previous comment mentioned that indirect assessments are really helpful when you're starting to build a behavior definition. Checklists are not really great when you're starting to build a behavior definition. And that's because you're just putting a piece of paper in front of somebody and saying, tell me when this behavior happens. But if they don't know what the behavior actually looks like, or they have a different conceptualization of what the behavior looks like, that's not going to help you, because people are going to be filling out the checklist for different things. And that's important to note, because oftentimes stakeholders, when there are multiple stakeholders, have different priorities for an individual. So it's really important that you have a clear, strong definition before you move on to checklists, especially if you're giving those to multiple people. Checklists are also really good when you need quantifiable information. So we'll give you an example of a checklist in a moment, and you'll see what I mean when I say quantifiable. But if you have multiple stakeholders and you need to aggregate, like, this is generally what people think is happening, then checklists are really good for that. You can even end up saying, looks like 50% of his staff think that this is an attention function, and 50% think that it's a demand function. And that might give you even more rationale, if you needed rationale, to move on to an open-ended interview or to direct observation. And there's some things that you should consider when you're selecting a checklist. And this is just a little literature review. And if you shoot me an email, and I've put my email in the chat a few times, but I'll put it in again, I can send you some resources specifically about identifying checklists that are reliable, valid, and easy to use. And these are really important to consider, because you're ideally giving these to individuals where they fill out mostly by themselves, so that you can give them to multiple individuals. But it's important that you have a checklist that measures what it says it's going to measure. And if people take it over and over again, they will generally fill it out the same way. And there has been some studies about whether or not different checklists are reliable and valid. So it's good to reference those before selecting a checklist. So I'm going to go ahead and show you an example of a checklist that has pretty decent reliability and validity scores. And this is the questions about behavioral function checklist, which was developed by Mattson and Vollmer in 1995. So this is a pretty similar structure as a lot of the other checklists I've used or looked at include, which starts with a little bit of directions, but you may be able to tell from this that the directions aren't as clear as you might want them to be as behavior analysts. But generally, they will say something about rate how often the client demonstrates the behaviors in the situation that occur, rate how often each behavior occurs, not what you think a good answer would be, right? So you're just asking people for their genuine perceptions of the behavior, not something that they necessarily think you want to hear. So, and then you generally rate them from does not apply or 0 to 3, with 0 being never and 3 being often. And then you can see at the bottom the list of different questions that are included here. So engages in the behavior to get attention, engages in the behavior to escape work or learning situations. And you may be already be able to notice that those common functions that Catherine spoke about earlier are reflected very early in this checklist. There are many more questions in this checklist, but these are just a few of them. I can talk to you a little bit more about what I do and don't like about this checklist, but I don't think that's the purpose of today. So I'll move forward, but just want to highlight again how this could be helpful if you have people who have a decent idea what the behavior looked like and you need to get information from a lot of people. Now, open-ended interviews are really good if you're trying to develop operational definitions, which someone said earlier, which I appreciate, and if you're trying to identify times to observe the behavior. And I really can't emphasize this enough, and maybe it's because there is a period of time where I was trying to collect data on the behavior that was happening, and I think I observed for 2 months and never saw the behavior occur. And that was, a pretty large waste of resources at that time. So it's very important to try to identify the times where the behavior is likely to occur. Additionally, if you're trying to identify what is important to stakeholders, and this goes hand in hand with building rapport. So if you're trying to convince stakeholders that what you want them to do is right and important, then you need to make sure that what you are doing is what's important to them. So it's just like, of course, the primary client is our number1 priority, but those stakeholders who help the individual through their days are going to be really important to talk to about this. Additionally, if you want more detailed information or anecdotes, so if you do a bunch of checklists and then you say, everyone thinks that this is different, open-ended interviews are a good thing to pivot to. Additionally, if everyone says it's random, I have no idea, it seems really idiosyncratic, then open-ended interviews are a very good idea. But of course, when you're considering whether or not to do an open interview, it's important to consider how much time you have to complete the interview. There's a bunch of different open-ended interviews that already exist. And again, if you shoot me an email, I can send you some examples. And some of these are very long, and some of these are much shorter. So it's important to think, how much time do I have to complete the interview? And then what questions do I need to make sure I ask when completing this interview? Now I'm going to show you just a little parts of an example of an open-ended interview. So the functional assessment interview, FAI, is a really common open-ended interview that's been cited heavily in the literature. And what I love about the FAI is that it has questions that I wouldn't immediately think of that are so important as I move forward with my FBA and with the development of my behavior support plan. So just for example, it asks you to initially describe the behaviors. So not just how it looks, which it does ask you to do, but also how often, how long, and how intense it is. And as you can probably see just from this description, this information is going to be really helpful with figuring out how urgent the situation is. So if the behavior is incredibly intense, likely to cause harm, this is where you're going to get an idea of that. It also asks you about antecedent events, when it is likely or not likely to occur. And when you're doing a functional behavior assessment, it's really important to know when the behavior is likely to occur, but it's also really informative to know when the behavior is not likely to occur. So for example, if the behavior is always likely to occur when they wake up in the morning, but is not likely to occur for the rest of the day, that helps you so much starting to identify what is so specific about the morning and what are aspects of the rest of the day that we can add into the morning to prevent that morning from being so problematic. And then just the last examples of questions I'll give, and we'll get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty, but I wanted to give you an example of how helpful these open-ended interviews can be sometimes. So this also asks about the skills that the person currently has. So functional alternative behavior that the person already knows how to do. What are their skills? And that's going to help you pick your replacement behavior and get a better idea about function. Because when the caregivers fill out this questionnaire, they say, okay, well, they ask me for attention all the time. They ask me for their preferred activities all the time. And then you're sitting and you're saying, okay, well, do they know how to say stop? Do they know how to say no? Do they know how to communicate that they want things end? And then sometimes you'll see a light bulb come on when you're communicating with a caregiver and they say, no, I don't think they have a response for that. And that's already so informative for your FBA and for your development of your DSP. So those are just some examples of indirect assessments and how you would work through those. And now I'm going to chat with you a little bit about what's next. You did your indirect assessments. Are you done? Should you be finished? And my passionate answer is that you shouldn't be finished. This is a passionate answer coming from someone who's worked in a lot of different environments and understands that your time and your staff resources are probably limited. To the extent of your ability for your resources, please do not stop at indirect assessment. We have a lot of research that suggests that indirect assessments do not predict function well. As I mentioned earlier, caregivers are generally pretty bad at labeling antecedents and consequences that are actually evocative. And this makes a lot of sense to me because I am horrible at identifying the antecedents and consequences to my dog's problem behavior. Horrible at it. I have too much emotion involved. I'm involved in the behavior. I'm the one who is emitting the antecedent that is evoking my dog's problem behavior. And I, for the life of me, cannot identify the antecedents and consequences. And then I had a behavior specialist come in and observe me interacting with my dog, and they were able to tell me the antecedents and consequences really clearly. And that's the power of an unbiased observer, who's someone who's able to watch. And that's not something that you're going to be able to get through an indirect assessment. It's also really challenging to ensure that all stakeholders are really talking about the target behavior. And this is even if you have a really excellent definition. People come in to, their everyday life with their own biases and perceptions about what the behavior looks like or what it is or why it's important. So there's been frequently times where I'm conducting an interview specifically about aggression. And the caregiver talks about aggression some, but then switches between aggression and disruption. So yelling, screaming. And they say, these things happen at these different times. And I have to continue to clarify, are you talking about aggression? Are you talking about yelling and screaming? And that's going to end up making your indirect assessment a lot harder to interpret. And that's why including indirect and direct assessments in an FBA is really important for getting some nice conclusive FBA data that are help you so much with the development of your behavior support plan. And I'm going to talk about direct methods in two really broad categories today. First, I'm going to talk about direct methods that include only direct observation. So this is only that you are watching an individual as they interact with their environment. The second kind of direct method I'm going to talk about is direct methods that include changing the environment. So I don't necessarily mean experimental functional analysis. I know many of us don't have the resources or time to conduct an experimental functional analysis, but there are other methods that you could do that might make your descriptive observation go a little bit more quickly and be a little bit more reliable that do involve slight modifications to the environment that I'm going to talk about. And as I mentioned, the two types of direct methods, I'm going to talk about them in these specific categories: observation only and environmental manipulation. I know the word manipulation is really ugly and we don't really love it. I just could not think of a better word here. So if you have any thoughts for me, please pop them into the chat, how I could make this a little bit less hard on the ears. But essentially all I mean by environmental manipulation is changing little things about the environment to better understand why the behavior does or does not occur. And I'm going to start by talking about observation only, but I also know that I talk really fast and I've packed a lot of information into these 30 minutes that I've been chatting, and I promised you a break. So I think right now is probably a good time for us to go ahead and take that 10-minute break. Go get the water that you need, and feel free to pop any questions in the chat. Catherine and I, at least one of us, will be monitoring that chat during the time. Sorry, I realized I had stopped recording and had to start recording it again, are generally not really fluent at labeling environmental variables. So for example, when you're starting to train staff to collect data on what's happening before and after behavior, a lot of the times you'll get things like the individual became upset, then they hit me, and then they were still upset afterward. But as Catherine mentioned earlier, those antecedents and consequences aren't going to be super helpful in identifying the function of the behavior. So providing caregivers with a structured data collection form that looks like this will, and again, please let me know if you want the resource for this. I can send this to you in the email, and I've added my email in the chat form. So this is generally what the structured ABC form could look like. There's a million different variations of them. If you open another tab in Google, structured ABC reporting form, you'll see a lot of them, and you can maybe find one that suits your needs better than this one. This one was written specifically for a study that was teaching teachers how to collect descriptive observation data, descriptive assessment data. So it already has these things lumped into the categories. So if you're hoping that a caregiver or implementer is going to collect your functional behavior assessment data, then you can go to this structured ABC form and say, like, this is what you need to do. You need to check if right before aggression or disruption occurred, they were ignored, or check if a request was denied, etc. The other really nice benefit of this is that it has the definition of the behavior right on top. Additionally, if you're working in an environment and you're collecting the data, and this is easier for you, I highly recommend you do what's going to be easier for you. Sometimes when behavior is really high rate, meaning that it's happening almost faster than you can write, the structured ABC recording form is going to be way more helpful for you than trying to write down in the narrative form. And of course, as always, you can add little notes on the side of things that you think are interesting or maybe important. So like, this is the second day that Lou threw something at lunch and it happened to be lasagna, something like that. So when we take the narrative, it's important to think about, okay, how would I categorize this into the structured data collection example? And we already worked on that a bit earlier. So what's nice about narrative is that you can maybe take it and go ahead and add it into your structured data collection form. But additionally, it's already giving you that pre-sorting that I mentioned. So I'm going to go ahead and skip past these couple things for the sake of time because I built in some redundancy for us. Okay, so those are two of your different forms of data collection that you could do. As a reminder, that was the structured and the narrative. And now I'm going to talk about what you can do that involves the environmental manipulation, which I mentioned, but I'm going to switch to environmental modification in the future. And this is called a structured descriptive assessment. And I apologize for how similar that language is to the structured data recording method of a descriptive assessment. But a structured descriptive assessment is actually a different thing. And this has been evaluated and compared to experimental functional analyses with really positive results in the past. So a structured descriptive assessment involves you requesting that caregivers put normally occurring antecedents in place. And then you ask them to react as they normally would. So an example of structured descriptive assessment for Lou, let's circle back to Lou for a second, might be if I have been trying to identify what the behavior looks like for Lou, but I just could not seem to get an observation period where Lou is engaging in the behavior. I might ask his staff and say, hi, like, do you often ask Lou to do things? Like ask him to do chores or tasks like that. And his caregiver might say yes, or they might say no. If the caregiver says yes, I'm going to say, could you ask him to do a chore? just the way that you normally would. And let me just see what happens. And of course, if the caregiver says like, no, I don't want to do that, don't make them do it. But also that might be an interesting piece of information. There's been a few times that I've done structured descriptive assessments and I've asked a teacher oftentimes, do you mind asking them to do some math and just letting me see what happens? And the teacher will say, oh, I never asked them to do math. And I think all of us at this point are like, I wonder if the individual gets really upset when they're asked to do math. And that might already give you some information about function. But it is really important here to ask them to react as they normally would. And this might be faster because you're starting to put some of these antecedents in place that may or may not be evocative of behavior, but you're also kind of testing these different antecedents. Okay, so they just put a demand in place and nothing happened. It might be that specific demand, or it may be that demands are not evocative of problematic behavior. But before we talk a little bit more about that, I want to do some warnings about the structured descriptive assessment. When you're asking individuals to put different antecedents in place, sometimes it may evoke behavior. So if you say, please put a demand in place for Lou, and then Lou engages in problematic behavior, that might be problematic, especially if the behavior is dangerous. But again, if that's what you're trying to see, the structured descriptive assessment may be beneficial for that. Additionally, there's potential staff reactivity. And what you really don't want is staff to do something that they wouldn't normally do, because what that's going to end up doing is biasing your form. So for example, if staff generally never ask Lou to do anything, but they don't want to tell you that they don't generally ask Lou to do anything, they may go ahead and ask him to do something. And it may be the first time that he's been asked to do something in a while, and he may engage in problem behavior, but that may not actually be the common antecedent or function to the behavior. So that's just something to keep an eye on. Additionally, staff may react differently than they normally would just because they know you're watching. So be careful when you're making these modifications, and it's helpful when you're doing a structured descriptive assessment to have a really good rapport with the individual that you're asking to place the antecedents in place. And just be careful about how you ask individuals to put certain antecedents in place too. You definitely do not want them to create an environment that is not typical, as I've mentioned a few times. So if you do say, go ahead and put a demand in place, and then they put the demand in place and no behavior occurs, don't say, okay, put a harder demand in place. Maybe that's for another time or day, or you can ask them, okay, well, do you think that demand is a challenging one for them or not? But definitely don't try to create these states of deprivation during these structured descriptive assessments, unless it's absolutely necessary for what you're doing, but that gets a little bit complicated and we won't go into that today. Okay, so now I'm gonna go into just some different pros and cons of different descriptive assessment types. And largely this is gonna be a review. And then we're gonna work together to pick some different descriptive assessments that you're gonna use for your FBA based on the different resources that you have. So first, for our first indirect assessment type, we have checklists. And this can be given to multiple stakeholders really quickly and provides easily quantifiable information, which are two really nice pros of this. The cons, however, are that for a lot of different descriptive assessment checklists, there are mixed data on reliability and validity. Additionally, it's really challenging to identify idiosyncratic variables, as we talked about earlier. For our second type of indirect assessment, our open-ended interviews, some pros, that they may identify idiosyncratic variables. If you ask the right questions and the individuals have noticed the thing, that they're pretty flexible too. So as I mentioned, if things are starting to look like a certain function, you can follow that path down if you think that's the right move and using your clinical judgment. Additionally, one of the things that I really love about open-ended interviews is that you can use them to build rapport if you do them well. There's a lot of resources online about how to do open-ended interviews well. And one of my favorite resources is the motivational interviewing treatment integrity sheet. And what that does is it describes to you different behaviors that you can do that clinical psychologists often do when they're doing therapy that increase the likelihood that you're going to build rapport with individuals when you're conducting these open-ended interviews. And then some cons to open-ended interviews is that depending on the interview, they may require a decent amount of time. So I only showed you a few segments of the questions from the functional analysis interview tool, or the FAI. But that FAI, if you do the whole thing, can take multiple hours, depending on how much the person you're interviewing has to say. So it may be important there to pick and choose the questions that are important for that individual if you have a limited amount of time, or to find a shorter open-ended interview. Additionally, open-ended interviews are kind of challenging to conduct with multiple stakeholders because you have to have, again, all of that time over and over again. Okay, and now for our direct methods, some pros of the narrative data recording is that you may be able to identify idiosyncratic variables, and they're pretty flexible. But some cons are that they require extensive training. So there's been a lot of different research studies that have looked at how do we train people to be successful at descriptive assessment observations. And generally what comes up is the best way to train people on descriptive assessment observations where they're likely to end up being a reliable observer is by using a structured data recording sheet. Additionally, narrative data recording may take a long time to complete. It just depends on how frequently the behavior happens. If you're working with low rate behavior and you want to be able to identify a pattern before you make statements about function, it might take you a while to get multiple observations under your belt where you're able to see that behavior happen. Next, structured data recording. Easier to train staff to complete relative to narrative. Also easier if there is high rate behavior, as I previously mentioned, where you just have to scratch things out really quickly. Additionally, it already has information sorted into categories. So when you get into interpretation, you want to make graphs, it's much easier to quantify than your narrative may be. Some cons, again, may miss idiosyncratic variables. And the same as the narrative data recording, it may take a long time to complete if the behavior only happens infrequently, especially. And then last but not least, for our last direct observation type, which is again our one that includes the environmental modification. The structured descriptive assessment may reduce the time spent observing without usable information, and it may inform how staff generally react to behavior. But on our cons, it may cause staff reactivity and it may evoke challenging behavior. So use all of these with caution, but especially that last one. Okay, so now let's work together to pick some different assessments. If you guys want me to flip back to the screen so you can reference it, please do let me know. So this is a Pear Deck prompt. And which of the assessments, and you can pick multiple assessments. So try to combine some of your indirect and direct assessments. But let me know if the behavior occurs across multiple environments at low rates, what kind of descriptive assessments do you think you could use? And again, this is a Pear Deck prompt. Okay, lovely. I see that a lot of you are putting in some different answers. And I think that's a good note to have here is that there's not always one right answer. So some of you who are filling in this Pear Deck response may have a certain case in mind. And that case may flag to you, okay, this would be helpful there and this would be helpful there. But what I'm asking is generally, if the behavior happens across multiple environments at low rates, if maybe your peer came up to you and said, what should I do about this? I'm having trouble getting data. What are some things that you could think about? Loving a lot of these answers. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and lock the responses in a few seconds. Oh, I love that some of you are bringing information that I haven't described here into the training. I'm definitely going to talk about that. Okay, I'm going to lock responses and show them. Okay, so I really like that a lot of you have said the checklist, and that might be really helpful if this is happening across multiple environments to get an idea of what different stakeholders think is important in the behavior happening or not happening. It's interesting to me that many of you said narrative data recording for the low rate behavior, but I wonder if that's because you have the time to write down the other things that are happening in the environment that may end up being important and idiosyncratic. And because you have less opportunities to get that information because the behavior is happening less frequently. And then I had to spotlight this one, even though I haven't talked about a scatter plot analysis, because if somebody talks about scatter plots and my heart just flutters a little bit and I have to talk a little bit about it. So if you're not sure what a scatter plot is, I don't have, unfortunately, the time to go into that today, but please look it up. There are a lot of resources online where you can even find directions on how to do a scatter plot, an Excel form for making a scatter plot as well. But essentially what a scatter plot does is you're able to put in different periods of time, even the activities that are happening at those periods of time, and staff can just put in whether or not the behavior happened in that period of time. And then over time, you can start to collect more of these data, and it'll essentially like color in when the behavior is and isn't likely to occur. And it makes your data analysis really nice and easy. And it also helps you get an idea, especially when there are some of those big setting events in place. So for example, I've done a scatter plot analysis before when I was unsure of what the function was, and it turned out it was happening for a few days every month, and then it would go away. A few days every month, and then it would go away. And what ended up being the relevant setting event is when the individual's menstrual cycle. So we were able to get the individual some medication for cramps, and it really increased their success in their various environments. And I don't think we would have been able to detect that without a scatter plot analysis. So thank you for those of you who are bringing that information in. Okay, let's do another one. So the behavior occurs in a single, yes.
Just a couple people have mentioned that it might be helpful if you could go back to the screen that showed the name of the analyses that they could select to answer these. So perhaps after you read through the prompt, you could go back to that. People can look over it, decide what they're going to answer, and then we can go back and enter.
Perfect. Thanks so much for communicating that to Catherine, everybody. Okay, so this one for choosing the assessment. The behavior occurs in a single environment, and the direct caregiver reports that the behavior appears extremely random on the intake form. So as Catherine said, I'm going to circle back to the chart. I'll give you guys a few minutes to look over that, and I'll go back to this slide for your responses. So the names are over here: checklist, open-ended interview, narrative data recording, structured data recording, and structured descriptive assessment. I'll give you all until 11:23 to look at this, which I know isn't a lot of time. I'm just really eager to make sure we got through the entirety of the training today. Okay, I'm going to go ahead back to the prompt. So the behavior occurs in a single environment, and the direct caregiver reports that the behavior appears extremely random on the intake form. I am loving a lot of these answers. I'm going to go ahead and spotlight a few. And I'm going to let you guys continue to type here because I do want to hear what everyone has to say, but I want to go ahead and talk about some of the good examples. So some that I really like, this first one, structured descriptive assessment, maybe even an open-ended interview to gather more information to set up your structured descriptive. Absolutely. I love combining open-ended interviews and structured descriptive assessments, especially because it might help you a little bit get at how reactive are the staff being. So are they doing what they normally do according to the interview during the structured descriptive assessment, et cetera. But it'll also help you pick periods of the day to ask them to put certain antecedents in place, right? So you don't want to show up at 8 a.m. when the individual is about to have breakfast and say, okay, but I'm here real quick. I need to do a structured descriptive assessment. Can you ask this person to do math? Because that's not what they would ordinarily be doing. They might be hungry. You might be evoking behavior that's not normally happening, right? This next one, narrative. Really nice thought there. Because the caregiver says it's extremely random, it might be a good idea to go in with a thought of, okay, there might be some idiosyncratic variables here that are important. It may not be the case. It may not be really random. You may be able to walk into the room and say, this looks like an escape function to me, but having that ready in your back pocket, especially when caregivers report that it's random, is very helpful. And then open-ended interview structured data reporting, a totally reasonable way to go, especially if you're gonna ask the caregiver that works primarily with the individual to collect that data for you. Having that open-ended interview, training them on how to do that structured data recording is gonna be really nice. And a little plug for one of our trainings on, I think it's Friday of this week, we will be having a behavioral skills training, and that will talk to you about ways that you could effectively train some more of the complicated things like structured data reporting. Okay, and this is our last one of these for choosing an assessment. I'll read this to you and then I'll flip back to the slide that has all the names of it. Okay, so you're not given the hours to directly observe and there are multiple caregivers. As I mentioned before, please do direct observation. Here is the list of types. I'll be here for just 30 seconds. I saw some people already popping in that this was something they wanted to do. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, so many of you saying checklists are good here. So if there are multiple caregivers, checklists are really wonderful for this. But I also love that a lot of you are saying interviews as well, because that's really helpful too. And then someone in here said structured data reporting, which absolutely, maybe you don't have the hours to directly observe, but maybe you do have the hours to train staff to directly observe. Obviously, that depends on the resources, but if you have a savvy implementer who can do some direct observation for you, that's going to really support your ability to develop a strong hypothesis about what the function of the behavior is. So thank you again for all your responses. And I am going to go ahead and move on to our next section because I want to make sure that we have time to answer some of your questions at the end. Okay, so this next section is how do you interpret the data from your evaluation? And this is, you know, a decently big question. You do the interviews, you do the direct observation, and then you have a lump of data in front of you, hopefully. And starting to weed through that is quite a process sometimes, depending on the type of methods that you used. So I'll start with the easiest one. And these are our checklists. And the questions about behavioral function, which is the checklist that I showed you at the beginning of my section, that was created by Matson and Vollmer in 1995, actually has a how to score right here at the bottom. And it has the answers to each of the questions about how they would be categorized here as well. So you could draw this up and you could say, okay, based on caregiver A and B report, looks like an attention function. But based on caregiver C and D report, it looks like a tangible function. And you can start to get this information aggregated. One thing to note, just so you all are aware, there is some research and some of my personal experience to suggest that attention is a really common false positive when you're doing direct observations or indirect assessments. And essentially what that means is a lot of people will say that people are doing behavior to get attention when that's not necessarily the case. And that really does make sense when you think about how different consequences may co-occur. So for example, if you're talking about an escape function and the individual is presented a demand, hits their teacher, and then the demand is removed, the teacher also probably says, don't do that, don't hit, and then removes the demand. So when you're filling out your form, you're gonna get the attention and you're gonna get the escape there. So I just wanted to add that as a caveat. That does not mean that if you get an attention function by completing your FBA, that it's not valid. It just is something to look for.
I just want to add on to that real quick, Stephanie, that where we see attention is often brought up and may not actually be the real reason, escape is very often left out. So it's really easy to say, oh yeah, like we were doing work and then all of this stuff happened. And what that really indicates is potentially escape, right? Because they're not representing the demand. But because escape means nothing happening and people are well trained and they're talking about things that are happening because they want to talk about behavior, it can be really easy for some escaping a task to go unmentioned as well.
Yes, absolutely. And that's also the reverse case when you're talking about a low attention antecedent, because there's really nothing happening in the environment. That's generally pretty challenging for people to detect. But thank you. Thank you for your point. Okay, so back on to interpreting data. Unfortunately, I don't have something super nice and clean to give you for open-ended interviews and narrative reporting analysis. And this is because it largely depends on the questions you're asked during the interview. You could categorize these things and quantify them as we've been working through, and we'll work through a little bit later. But also you could focus on summarizing important points in a few paragraphs or reports. So kind of just what this ends up looking like a lot of the time is a few sentences that say, multiple caregivers have reported that this individual engages in problem behavior when they're asked to sweep. Something like that. Okay, so I'm going to give you kind of an example. I conducted an open-ended interview with Jerry. Well, Jerry's caregiver, excuse me, about Jerry's aggression. And just highlighting kind of what I looked through the open interview and I said, I think these are the most important pieces. And what I found was that Jerry was most likely to aggress in the mornings when he was doing self-care tasks, and least likely during free play periods. Right before Jerry aggressed, he was asked to complete a self-care task. He did not complete the self-care task when asked, and physical prompting occurred following noncompliance. So he just did nothing, and then caregivers started to physically prompt him to brush his teeth. And then after Jerry aggressed, staff reprimanded him and left him alone, and they came back in about 10 minutes to try to prompt him to engage in that behavior again. So how can we categorize these initial pieces of data? So he's most likely to engage in problematic behavior in the mornings during self-care tasks, and least likely during free play periods. And this again is a paradigm response. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and lock it out again, even though I know that many of you are still answering just for the sake of time. And many of you have said demand. And what's really nice about the data that we collected on when it was most likely and least likely is that these two pieces of information actually support one another. So the behavior is most likely to occur when he's asked to do self-care tasks. And it's least likely to occur when no one is asking him to do anything during free play periods. So sometimes those pieces of information of most and least likely can actually support each other to make you a little bit more confident in what you think may be the function. Sometimes they don't support each other, but that's a conversation for a different day. Okay, now what about for his antecedent data? How can we categorize these? And this is again a paradigm response. So here is a really good example of when it would be helpful if Pear Deck allowed us to select multiple, right? Because there are multiple things that are happening in this situation before Jerry aggressed. So many of you said demand. He's asked to complete a self-care task. That would be a demand. And then some of you also said other. And if I had to guess why you said other, it was probably because the addition of physical prompting doesn't actually fit neatly in one of those categories. What that is really is attention being added rather than a lack of attention. And as I'm sure many of us have encountered an individual who finds attention, especially physical attention, really aversive, you could also categorize this antecedent if it were to come up frequently as a social avoidance function, is one of the things that we call it. So it's kind of like a flip of a low attention function. But it's another one of those things to highlight here where idiosyncratic variables are important. So if you're seeing in these data that frequently it comes up that when this individual is physically prompted to engage in a behavior, they engage in aggression, you may end up having someone who finds physical prompting really aversive. And that makes a lot of sense. Physical prompting is not always pleasant for folks. Okay, and then last one. How do we categorize these for after Jerry aggression? Yeah, and this makes sense that I've split the room a little bit more here. So many of you are selecting low attention, which is absolutely the case. The staff are reprimanding him, which is meaning that there may be attention as a reinforcer for this behavior. And then many of you are also saying demand or escape from a demand as staff leaving him alone and coming back in that 10 minutes. So essentially you can think about that as a break. He is told to do something, he hits staff, and they give him 10 minutes by himself. And that might start to look more and more like an escape function as you move forward. Okay, thank you all again for selecting these. I also see many of you put other, which I think makes a lot of sense since multiple of these could be selected. Additionally, I want to add here that although we are showing you these little pieces of information with one antecedent and one consequence, it's really important to collect data on multiple times that the behavior happens so that you can start to piece together a pattern, because a pattern is how you're going to be able to start to ascertain the actual function of the behavior. Okay, now I'm going to take a little bit of time and shift gears for just the last section of this and talk about developing summary statements. Another shameless plug for our training on Wednesday at 9 a.m. We're going to talk a lot about summary statements and how to use a summary statement to inform your behavior support plan, as well as I think how to write them. I think that's included in that, but Catherine, please tell me if I'm wrong. We've been working on these trainings pretty simultaneously. Okay, so for summary statements, what you do with these is you summarize the relevant information. So ideally, a summary statement includes the setting events that you've identified, common antecedents, what the behavior is, and consequences. So we're circling back to Jerry. What we found out during our interview is that Jerry was most likely to engage in aggression during the mornings during self-care tasks. And that right before he was asked to engage in self-care tasks, right before the behavior happened, he was asked to complete self-care tasks. And after the behavior happened, staff reprimanded him and left him alone. So if this turned into a pattern, if we observed every single day in the morning, and this is consistently what the behavior looked like and when it was happening, the summary statement we may develop is that Jerry's most likely to engage in aggression when staff used physical prompting to assist him with self-care tasks. Aggression may be especially likely to persist when followed by escape from the self-care tasks. And again, this is if a pattern develops and we're starting to see that leaving him alone looks like the reinforcer. So let's talk about a different example now, Tabitha. So we have here that Tabitha is most likely to engage in screaming during unstructured time and least likely during staff-guided activities. Before she screams, it's reported that nothing happens, she's just by herself. And after she screams, staff soothes her. So if you were going to categorize all of the data based on this anecdote, what do you think the possible function of Tabitha's screaming could be? Okay, lovely. We have almost unanimous agreement here that low attention would likely be the function if this turned into a pattern. In the beginning, before the behavior, she's sitting alone, nothing is happening. And at the end, staff soothe her. And the thing to note about how this is written is a lot of the times, if you're asking during an interview, what is happening before the behavior? People say absolutely nothing. And sometimes that provides a hint to me. I wonder if they're not receiving a lot of attention at that point, if they're not able to identify an event that occurs before the behavior. So now just practice a little bit, and I'll give you a little bit more time for this, to try to write a summary statement for these data. And just as a reminder, a summary statement should include relevant setting events, antecedents, consequences, and what the behavior actually looks like. The way that I like to think of a summary statement is just a brief couple of sentences about what the results of my functional behavior assessment are. And I know that's funny to think about. You put all this time into developing a functional behavior assessment, and you probably learn a lot of really valuable things about Tabitha. And then I tell you, okay, now put it in a sentence. And that sounds silly, but when you talk about starting to disseminate this information and including it in behavior support plans, ideally you have a lot of information about the results of your behavior support plan of your FBA and a behavior support plan. But that's not always the case. You may not always have the space. The form may not allow for it. And these summary statements are a nice immediate piece, especially if you have staff that you think they do not have the time to read through my entire functional behavior assessment report. And a summary statement might be the right answer. Okay, I am loving so many of these responses. I'm going to highlight a few of them and then keep going. Okay. So here's a few that I think are really interesting. The first one, when Tabitha is left alone with little to no attention for a period of time, she engages in screaming. Her screaming behavior is likely reinforced by the attention delivered following the behavior in the form of staff soothing her. What I really love about this one is that it provides you antecedent and consequence information, and it also gives you information about what the consequence looks like. So it's not just like staff reprimanding her after she screams, she gets soothed after she screams. And that might be an important piece of what the actual reinforcer is. I think this one is a really nice, concise explanation of what could be happening. And then I like this one too, especially because you're saying during unstructured time and you include that. But it's also important in this example to provide what the possible reinforcer is. So because we've maybe attended this training and a bunch of trainings like it, we might be able to look at that and say, okay, so I think the reinforcer is probably attention. But it's important to explicitly state that for individuals who don't have the similar training as we do. Okay, thank you again for including those paradox responses. So as I've mentioned before, when you're analyzing these data, it's really important to start to identify a pattern. You look for themes across interviews, look for information from interviews that match your observation results, look for themes across checklists, all of the things. The pattern is going to be the key. And what's really, really nice about a structured ABC reporting form is sometimes there's a pattern spelled out for you. You can see it clear as day. The antecedent is always the same, and the consequence is always the same. So when we see a structured data recording form that looks like this one, what do we think the possible maintaining variable for the challenging behavior of aggression and disruption is? So take another second to look at this and come up with your hypothesis, and then I will bring up the paradigm for you to select multiple choice. Okay, great. I'm gonna go ahead and bring up the paradigm. And it has it here on the right of the screen for you to reference. What do we think the possible function is of this? Aggression. Okay, great. So we have a pretty unanimous agreement that based on this structured ABC reporting form, it looks like denied access might be the function of this individual's behavior. So let's break that down a little bit and talk about how we get to that conclusion. So up here we have the behavior, and here we have the antecedents. So consistently, each time before the behavior happens, this observer marked that leisure materials or food were removed or denied. So there's our antecedent. Okay, so it sounds like something that they maybe liked was taken away from them. And then we go to our consequences. And access to food and leisure materials or activities was given back following that behavior. And that's easy to see. And I often, when I get data sheets like this and I see that it might be a denied access function, think about just when I was growing up. I grew up with 2 older siblings, and I often, would be upset if they took away a toy from me. And that would probably be the antecedent and consequence to, I'll let you fill in the blank of what I mean when I say upset. But right, that's an easy thing to conceptualize, for me at least, from my personal experience, that having something removed and getting it back contingent on the behavior would be reinforcing. So let's do the same thing again. What could be a summary statement for this? And I know you have a lot less information that you did on the last one, but just write something really quick for me. And we'll stay on this prompt for about a minute and then move on. And then I think we're going to end up having time for questions. Oh, you guys are putting in some really great summary statements. I can tell that you've done this before, which I'm thrilled to see so many wonderful answers. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight one so that we have time for questions. Okay. So the individual engages in aggressive, disruptive behavior each time the leisure material, food are withheld. Following each episode of denied access, individual is returned access by the caregiver. Yeah, so this doesn't explicitly say that the returned access is likely the reinforcer, but this is a ABC statement, right? So leisure materials are withheld, aggressive behavior occurs, denied, and then is returned by the caregiver, which is also a nice way to explain the patterns that happen in the environment that maintain that behavior. And similar as the one below, very similar and wonderful. So the example that I gave you was a really nice, clean, structured data recording sheet. And unfortunately, it's not always going to come out that way. So what we may end up getting is something that looks a little bit more like this, where sometimes the antecedent is denied access, sometimes they're ignored by a teacher, sometimes the request is denied, etc. And then the consequences don't even necessarily match the antecedents in the way that it would make you feel more confident about your function. And that's okay. There are some ways that we can problem solve unclear FBA results. The first one that I mentioned earlier that I always start with is how precise is the definition of your behavior. So if we go back to this form and we look at the definition of the behavior, there is a lot of different topographies or forms of behavior that are lumped into this one definition. So we're recording data anytime that the individual hits someone, throws an object, knocks over furniture, or pushes objects off furniture. But each of those are a distinct behavior that could be maintained by different reinforcers. So if you're getting unclear FBA results, sometimes it's helpful to make your definition a little bit more specific to identify the specific reinforcers for a specific behavior. Otherwise, you might have multiple functions. And for the sake of time, that might be okay that you have multiple functions. You just need to create a plan that will address those multiple functions. Next, are multiple stakeholders collecting the data? That's always a good question to ask. And if so, have they been well trained? Do you need to do a follow-up training to make sure that everybody's still on the same page? Do you need to show them examples and non-examples of what the target behavior actually looks like, right? As Catherine mentioned earlier, you may have an observer when you're collecting data on hitting that's also getting some data on high fives. If you haven't explicitly written into your example that it needs to leave a mark or that high fives are a non-example of behavior, and that might be messing with your data a little bit. Next, it's nice to think about if there are patterns within contexts or situations. So for example, if you provide checklists to mom and dad, and the checklist for mom looks like one thing and the checklist for dad looks like another thing. But then you go and do some structured data recording in mom's house and dad's house, and your structured data recording matches mom's checklist in mom's house and matches dad's checklist in dad's house. What might happen there is that there are different motivating operations in place that increase the likelihood of certain behaviors and certain patterns occurring. And that's okay. You just may need to cater the plan specifically for the different situations and environments that the individual is in. And then last, but certainly not least, what FBA methods did you use? So if you have unclear FBA results and you only use indirect assessment, that's a really good sign to stop, backpedal, and get some eyes on the behavior. As I mentioned earlier, don't stop at indirect assessment because it's not going to give you the strongest hypothesis about what the function of the behavior is. Make sure you get some eyes on the behavior. Okay, so thank you so much for your attention. I know that this was a lot of material that we've put into this time. We really hope to see you again at our behavior support training, behavior support plan training, and all the other trainings that we hold. The behavior support plan training is going to be on Wednesday, so 2 days from now, June 9th at 9 a.m. again. And then after the behavior support plan training, there's also a behavior skills training on Friday at 9 a.m. again. So we'd love to see you. And this is our last time that we're going to ask you for your About You information in Pear Deck. So please make sure you fill this out. We're asking for your name first. I'll wait for a decent amount of you to fill it out. Oh, you guys are going pretty fast on this one. Great. Okay, I'm going to give you guys another few seconds for inputting your name. I'm still missing about 30 of you for putting your name in. So just another few seconds, and then I'll pop up the email prompt. Okay, responses have slowed down. So go ahead and put your email in here. And then while you all do that, I'm going to put my email address in the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and let me know what I can do for you.
And I'll put mine in there as well. Don't email either of us though. And if you email the wrong one of us, we'll just forward it along.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then last but not least, this is not one for your name or email. I just really want to hear what you liked and didn't like about the training, which is why this is an open-ended question. We are presenting, as we mentioned and Nathan mentioned at the beginning, 4 more trainings to your organization. So we'd really like to be able to inform our subsequent trainings based on your feedback today. So please feel free to let us know what you did and did not like, and we appreciate it. In the meantime, while folks are doing that, I do see that there are people who are putting some thoughts in the chat, and we can talk a little bit about those with this last 7 minutes. So I see a lot of comments on examples and non-examples being really important when you have a definition for FBA, and I completely agree. I have often run into a lot of situations that I could have avoided had I provided some examples and non-examples. One of my favorite anecdotes of that is that I was collecting data on the effectiveness of an intervention for reducing aggression during recess. And the teachers were not collecting data on when the individual would tag someone during tag because of the context that, touch on another person was appropriate. But the data collectors that I sent in, I didn't add the non-example of unless they're tagging during tag. And it looked topographically like a hit. So the data between my data collectors and the teachers weren't matching up. And this is one of those examples where a non-example would be really helpful. Again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Thank you all so much for your feedback. I really appreciate it. Okay. If you guys have a question too, feel free to unmute your microphone. We're done with the structured contents for today. And yes, we will be following the same link for the trainings on Wednesday and Friday.
Let me just jump in real quick on that. Folks need to register for that. Okay, because we have a limited amount of slots. I don't think we're going to get to 300 capacity, but we could. So just make sure that you register for those, and I will send you the information to make sure that you are able to get into these subsequent trainings.
Perfect. Thank you, Nathan.
You bet.
Thank you, Nathan.
So Nathan, for this one, you found my email got bounced back to you. Am I going to have that same problem for the next ones? Because I registered for all 5 classes. And this
If you
is
type-
Michelle Guestwick.
Hey, Michelle, if you typed your email address incorrectly, then it will bounce back to me, but that will be a prompt for me because I know that it's you to email you the link. So
Okay, so I should be okay, because they
you should-
haven't been sent yet, right?
they haven't been sent. We're going to send them out probably about this time tomorrow, just to make sure
Okay.
that we keep them open as long as possible before we send the links out and such.
Okay, thank you very much.
You bet.
Okay, great. Well, I see that I haven't gotten a response in the feedback for a while, so I'm just going to go ahead and lock that and stop sharing my screen as well. Catherine and I will stay on here to answer any questions that you guys have, though, so please feel free to ask us any questions.
Let me just take a second to thank everybody as we're wrapping up here. This was absolutely an informative and comprehensive training, and I really just want to thank our presenters for taking the time to do this. And I'm really excited about the 4 upcoming trainings that are to come later this month as well. And I want to thank the participants. I was just blown away by some of the thoughtful responses that came in those ASRs. It was really cool to see them come up and see the engagement that folks had with this training topic. And as noted, you can follow up with the presenters if you'd like to dialogue with them further. If you scroll all the way back up to the chat box, you can also see that my contact information is there. I also put the contact information for my colleague, Sharon Bonaventura, who's also a behavior analyst here at DBHDS, if you want to dialogue with us about things that are more DBHDS specific, like questions about service authorization, things like that, or questions on the changes to regulations that have occurred that govern therapeutic consult behavioral services. And I think just kind of as I close here, I already alluded to this, but please make sure that you sign up for the future trainings. If you're interested, I will blast out a meeting link as soon as possible, probably about 24 hours before those trainings actually occur. Check your email address, make sure that you've done it so that it lines up with what your actual email address is. And just so everybody is aware, if you haven't looked at those, there's one on Wednesday. That's the intro to BSP development, the behavior skills training that's on Friday. Monday, the 21st, that's the advanced FBA. And Wednesday, the 23rd, the advanced BSP development. So with that said, I'll leave it open for Stephanie and Catherine if they'd like to add anything else. But again, I just want to thank everybody for their attention and their participation today.
I don't have anything to add except to emphasize Nathan's wonderful points. Thank you all so much for participating with us. We can't articulate to you how wonderful it is to have a group that's willing to chat back with us. I'm looking forward to doing less things on Zoom, but this definitely helps make Zoom a more fun and interactive experience. So thank you.